Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the special days that are described in Deuteronomy chapter 16 in our continuing study of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 16:1, observe the month of Abib and celebrate the Passover. That was the first month of the religious year, actually the only year. I know that we talk about having a civil year. That's something that the Israelites are going to borrow from the Babylonians. That's nowhere in the Bible. But here in Deuteronomy 16:1, observe the first month of Abib and celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night, and you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. Notice the emphasis on the place, and that's what we're going to see in this passage. So the first feast that we're looking at, and it sort of begins the whole series, is the Passover. It began the year of Israel. Notice verse 5, you are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which the Lord your God has given you, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. You shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset, at the time that you came out of Egypt. So it was to be a memorial, but notice there was now to be a specific place where the Jews were to meet, and God was going to direct what that place was. So Passover, notice the sacrifice at Passover is in the place that the Lord chooses. Verse 1, observe the month of Abib and celebrate the Passover your God. In the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. And the emphasis that we saw is that you're going to sacrifice to the Lord in the place where the Lord chooses. And so this the command had already been given to celebrate the Passover, but now there's going to be an emphasis upon what place it is. And we're going to see that not just with this feast, but with 3 of the feasts, where they are going to designate a particular place. Notice the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. Now, when the Israelites first go into the land, that place is going to be a place called Shiloh. And the tabernacle is going to be set up there. But notice in this drawing, the tabernacle is going to become semi-permanent. It's a little bit like those mobile homes, that we have sometimes. And you go into a mobile home park, and all the mobile homes are parked. In fact, they're not mobile at all. They're stationary. But they're technically mobile homes. I guess they could be moved, and the tabernacle is going to be like that too. The tabernacle is going to be stationary once they come into the land, and it's not going to move for hundreds and hundreds of years until it's replaced by the temple. So verse 9, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. You shall begin to count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. That is the time when Passover begins. You go 7 weeks after that. Verse 10, then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Sevens. What happens is you go 7 groups of sevens. 7 times 7 is 49, and you just add a day to make it to the end of the cycle. The Feast of Weeks, your God, with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give just as the Lord your God blesses you. Verse 11, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants and the Levite who's in your town. Notice, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your midst, in the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. Notice again the emphasis upon the place. So we saw the Passover, and with the Passover, and that that kicks off a whole week, the week of unleavened bread. But the Passover they were to sacrifice in the place where God chose. Now we see this Feast of Weeks, which takes place 50 days after the Passover. 7 times 7 weeks of sevens, and in that we're going to see both. There's a freewill offering, there's rejoicing, but notice the mention that the stranger is included. Now we refer to that by its Greek term. You count 50 days, and the way you say that in Greek is penta something or other, and so we call it Pentecost. And Pentecost is our Greek way of describing that feast. It's 49 weeks plus 1, so it's 7 weeks or 49 days plus 1, so it's 50 days later. That's why we call it Pentecost. And that was a time of free will offering and rejoicing. But notice the stranger was included. Then the third feast, verse 13, You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths. Now this is much later. Takes place in the fall. The Feast of Booths, 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants and the Levite, and again, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate a feast of the Lord your God in the place where the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce, in all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. Another joyful feast. So we had the Passover, we had the Feast of Weeks, and now we have what we could call the Feast of Booths, or if we want to call it the Feast of Tabernacles, that works as well. And it's a time of rejoicing, and again, the stranger is included. And notice the summary: 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord. These 3 feasts that we just mentioned shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that begins with the Passover, and the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. So we have the Passover, and we've noted already, the Passover, there's a sense in which that looks forward to our Passover. Our Passover is Jesus, who became our Passover lamb, died in our place. And then that second week, Pentecost, we in the church know that it just so happens it was at Pentecost that the Holy Spirit showed up. And he wrote God's law in our hearts, and he brought the Gentiles, which was part of the feast. And then the third feast, Booths or Tabernacles, and that's also fulfilled in Jesus, because he is the one who tabernacled with us. And he dwelt with us, taking upon himself human flesh, becoming one of us, and dwelling with us.